Thank you, Dr. Kang, for this wonderful presentation. I think it leads nicely into our discussion today about clinical trials for cancer patients in general, and more specifically for breast cancer. I think we all have to, pause and think about why do we put patients on clinical trials? Why, spend the time and effort into writing the studies, conducting them, and then moving them forward. And, we all know we wouldn't have these successful cancer treatments that we're able to provide to our patients. I mean, look at what the CDK4/6 inhibitors have done, and the new HER2-targeted therapies. They've really changed outcomes, and contributing to research and clinical trials is going to save lives and improve quality of lives. And so it's a very important mission for us physicians and healthcare providers in oncology. And, I think a big part of what we do when we talk to patients about clinical trials, explain to them what a clinical trial is, and really emphasize why they should consider one. For many of our patients, especially in the metastatic setting or the high-risk early-stage breast cancer, our patients may have access to new medications and treatments that they wouldn't otherwise have access to, because drug development takes time, and it may take months to a year from the time they're enrolled on the study for this drug to be approved. And if it works well, then they're able to get access to not only a novel drug, but one that is successful. And there are always concerns about safety and side effects and investigational agents, and I'll address that a little bit more down in my talk. But the issue is, honestly, we all know that you have the clinical team, the clinical research team. They have more eyes in visits and monitoring than they would if they were getting standard of care treatments. And that's important to explain to patients. And for patients, especially who go on early phase 1 studies with first-in-human, trials, yes, they hope to get a benefit, but we tell them that that's not really the goal of going on a phase 1 study, especially first-in-human. It's really to try to find the right dose for the drug, the right safe dose. But they know that by doing that, they can contribute to moving science forward and help patients, cancer patients who are diagnosed in the future. Now, with all the work and time that goes into clinical trials, if you look at data, less than 5% of all cancer patients are actually enrolled on a clinical trial. And less than 10% of those patients that go on studies are actually minorities. There's data that I'm going to share about limited access to clinical trials for diverse and underrepresented populations and rural areas. So I think, as we move forward drug development and clinical trials in oncology, we really need to address how to support access to clinical trials to all our patients, regardless of where they live or they get their treatments. So this actually comes from the Clinical Trials Landscape Report, which is very nice. If follow the link, you can go into. There's a lot of information about clinical trials in general, and also barriers to putting patients on studies, opening studies, and also diverse populations. But they report that 56% of patients will not have a local trial available for their cancer. And 17% of the patients that actually want to go on a study and screen for a study are ineligible for trial because of the exclusion criteria. And what is really worrisome is that many eligible patients say that they have not been asked by their provider or treating physician whether they're interested in clinical trials. Now, that may be that there is no clinical trial that is available for their specific cancer, but you have to think more about whether every patient is being offered a study when one is available. And they also report that greater than 50% of eligible patients actually do want to go on a study and they agree to do so. So maybe it's not really, part of it is increasing awareness about clinical trials, but a bigger issue here is what can we do to make clinical trials accessible to everybody in the community, in rural areas, and how to help providers and physicians, oncologists in their mission to offer and advance clinical trials. The patients in general who decline clinical trials do so because they're afraid of side effects, because they're concerned about loss of control. There's costs that are a concern. So, some studies, especially earlier stage studies, require more time away from work, more copays. If they have more visits, they may need to get more standard labs than they would if they were on study. So it's not even the research visits, it's not just the research component of the trial. And there's a lot of logistics, time away from family, transportation. If you live 3 hours away from a major cancer center and your local community oncology office does not have a specific study, there's a lot that plays in here into the decision for patients to participate on a clinical trial. And, this just gives a snapshot of, we do a little bit better in academic centers just because we probably have more studies and a lot more support than some of our colleagues in community practices, but still the enrollment rate is low. And, as we look at this, I think a big role here is trying to collaborate or have collaborations between academic institutions and the community. Often when I see new patients for clinical trials, they come to me and they've had multiple lines of treatment. So the majority of my, metastatic studies for first, second, third line are more challenging for me to put a patient on study, while my colleagues in the community tend to see those patients, so we have to make sure that those studies are open there. So we have to always say, how do we do better? I think, we're all very busy in clinic. We have to find technology and additional resources to support physicians and healthcare providers in the screening and clinical trial enrollment process. Like having website pathways like Via Pathway, where it connects you to a specific clinical trial that might be good for your patient when you're going in to enter a chemotherapy order. Having apps on your phone for clinical trials within your institution, or if you're a community, practice. If you work closely with an academic center so that you can screen quickly and see what trials are open. And I really think there has to be a lot of collaborative efforts with academic investigators. So I tend to offer colleagues to discuss a clinical trial by telehealth, for instance, for a patient, so they don't have to come in and drive an hour or so, unless we make sure that we have a study for them. And we do have to have outreach community efforts to increase awareness about a clinical trial. It's hard when a patient's diagnosed with cancer, and it's an overwhelming process. You're talking about standard treatments, and to throw in there another choice for a clinical trial. But if patients are aware before the diagnosis, they understand what a clinical trial, it makes the process easier. And we do have to train and have continuous education for providers, for physicians, oncologists, nurses, practitioners, PAs, to learn more about clinical trials, how you conduct a study, what are the important things, so that they don't find it as challenging during their busy clinic hours to try to enroll and follow patients on clinical trials. And this is a study of 20 community oncologists who were surveyed, and to look at barriers to participation in therapeutic clinical trials in the community. And 80% of them said that less than 5% of their patients were enrolled in a therapeutic trial. they identified system-level barriers. They said that some of the studies that they had came available to them really were not appropriate for the community-based setting, maybe too complex, maybe not the right patient population. And they didn't have an infrastructure that could support their patient enrollment on clinical trials. They found that the eligibility criteria were restrictive and they couldn't put as many patients who they would have liked to go on a study, and there were also financial limitations. And there were physician-specific barriers that they identified, and they said, it was anywhere from a lack of awareness of the available trials, lack of knowledge of the trial detail, and lack of time. And they also identified a couple of patient-level barriers as patient burden and negative beliefs and attitudes toward research. The authors had some recommendations about increasing trials available to community oncologists, having more support and research personnel, and promoting physician knowledge, and they felt these would be major facilitators. The Cancer Moonshot Task Force has called for steps to ensure that all Americans, including those that have limited resources and live far away from a major cancer center, that we have to work on getting them access to having leading-edge cancer treatments, prevention, screening approaches, and research. So when we look at this and, what do we do? So I think one of the major things that we need to address is diversity of clinical trial participation. Just having studies and even offering them to our patients is not going to be helpful if you don't help those that need support to go on a clinical trial. And why is it important? Because we need diversity in clinical trial participation so that we have adequate representation of the patients who will use the medication. We need to be able to generalize the results that we get from clinical trials. And it's really an opportunity to try to better understand the differences in the biology of some of the cancers in certain racial and ethnic populations, and why some of these cancers may be more resistant to treatment. So it's a really great opportunity to learn more and advance our knowledge and offer patients from various racial and ethnic backgrounds the opportunity to go in clinical trials so we can learn whether these treatments are appropriate for them. There has been reports, and this is a nice study that was published in JAMA Oncology. They looked at 230 trials supporting FDA oncology drug approvals, which were granted between 2009 and 2018. And they said race was reported in only 145 of these 230 trials. And in only 18 clinical trials did they split the data into the four major racial groups: white, Asian, Black, and Hispanic in the United States. And when they compared clinical trial participation amongst these racial groups, they found that Blacks and Hispanics were underrepresented compared to whites and Asians. So this is just one more, piece of the literature to support the fact that we need to do a better job when it comes to addressing disparities of race in clinical trials. So the U.S. FDA has issued a draft guidelines to really try to improve the diversity of patient populations in clinical trials. And one aspect of these guidance that they provided was to encourage sponsor companies to include more underserved populations, including women, elderly, and minorities in their clinical trials. Now, some of this is difficult because these large phase 3 studies are no longer just conducted in the United States. They're conducted in other parts of the world, which may, kind of sway the population to more towards, for instance, Asians, if it's in Asia versus, if it was a study that was conducted in the United States, you can try to enroll more minorities. So there are some challenges depending on where the studies are open. How do we promote diversity participation on clinical trials? We have to select sponsors, and academic investigators have to select sites that have diverse patient populations, such in big cities, for instance, like Philadelphia, where I practice. Sites should open studies that match the patient characteristics in the community that is served by the practice's catchment area. So, when we're choosing and selecting clinical trials, there's a lot of studies that are scientifically very interesting, but if they don't meet the needs of the catchment area, you have to think twice about whether that's the right study to open. And there has to be clinical trial navigation services for these patients that come in from underserved populations to make sure that they have the available resources to support their participation on the clinical trial, and to provide them with culturally sensitive education materials that explain what the studies are and the scientific rationale and why they should consider clinical trials in general. And really, there has to be a lot of effort in community outreach and partnership with community-based organizations that serve these racial and ethnic minority groups, and to promote awareness about clinical trials. And in my opinion, that has to happen for the general population, even before cancer diagnosis or any diagnosis of an illness. So patients have a basic understanding where you can build on that when it's time to offer them a clinical trial. And a big issue that comes is eligibility criteria. There are in every study, like study-specific eligibility criteria, but some of them are general and are there because of regulatory issues that you have to meet certain specific eligibility criteria and regulations set by the FDA. But you have to make sure you're not excluding patients from a certain racial or demographic subgroup who are more likely to have a certain comorbidity, as long as it's something where it doesn't affect a safety issue. And then there's language barriers. We have some Spanish-speaking patients who don't speak English that well. We have to have short consents and long consents that are translated into a specific language, and try to provide interpreter services so we're not excluding these patients from clinical trials. I'd like to share a bit of what we've been doing at the Sidney Kimmel Cancer Center at Jefferson Health, and to try to more specifically address our patient catchment area, which tends to be a diverse patient population. So we serve Philadelphia, Montgomery, Camden, and Delaware County, especially in our Center City campus. We are a large enterprise. We have multiple sites across Philadelphia, and we have a site in New Jersey. And we've been tasked to develop an enterprise-level breast research group to try to make sure that we have clinical trials throughout our enterprise at different sites, so patients don't really have to travel 2 to 3 hours to come to Center City or the academic campus to be on a clinical trial. And if you look at this table, you will find that in Philadelphia, 43 to 44% of our patients are actually African American, and we tend to see a good number of Asian patients and Hispanic patients, and that percent or ratio may be different across like Montgomery County, which tends to be some of our suburbs, versus Camden, New Jersey, and Delaware. So whenever we offer studies across the various sites, we have to take this into consideration. We also, if you look at the percent of persons in poverty, as you can see in Philadelphia, it's approximately 25%, and it's much higher than the other counties that we serve as well. So we have to make sure that we have community outreach and navigation systems that help our patients get the resources they need, whether it's financial, whether they need transportation, because they can't, they won't be able to go on a clinical trial unless you offer that support for them. And another thing that we are facing as well is that the incidence and mortality in breast cancer in Philadelphia, for instance, compared to the state of Pennsylvania and compared to national incidence. So while our incidence is in Philadelphia is comparable to the national incidence, our mortality rate is higher. And we're trying to understand, is it a delay in diagnosis? Is it more aggressive biology? But it's very important to understand this, and there's great efforts in the Cancer Center to try to understand what's leading to this and how can we improve outcomes. And this is just to show you that for breast cancer specifically, approximately 35% of the patients enrolled on clinical trials are African American, approximately 35% or 30% are Asians. And that really reflects somewhat of what our catchment area is. So we're trying very hard, and we find that our patients are really interested in clinical trials when you spend the time to explain the scientific rationale and try to support them through this process. I'm going to talk about a couple of studies that are specific to African American patients because we are participated in one and we're going to participate, or we're currently participating in the other. And the reason is that you really have to think about your catchment area, and if you have a diverse racial or ethnic group or underserved patient population, you have to see if there's studies specific that address certain outcomes or toxicity that they encounter. So this is a study that we collaborated with Dr. Linz and colleagues at Georgetown University to try to look at safety of giving the CDK4/6 inhibitor palbociclib in African American women who have metastatic disease. And the reason or the scientific rationale for this study is that we know that there's a benign ethnic neutropenia that we tend to see in African American women, and the concern was, does that cause dose reductions, dose delays when you're giving a CDK4/6 inhibitor that it does cause neutropenia, and whether that affects outcome. So the study enrolled patients, African American or Black patients who were eligible for treatment with a CDK4/6 inhibitor, and depending on their baseline absolute neutrophilic count, they either went on the standard dose or a dose that was lower at 100 milligrams a day, and there were serum and blood collection to try to see whether they have a genomic DNA change that we can monitor to see how they respond to the treatment, and more importantly, to find out if they tolerate treatment as well as others and whether their outcome is the same. And these are the published, these are the data that we presented at the San Antonio Breast Cancer Symposium, and manuscript is in development right now. But the preliminary results that were presented at that time showed that although some patients do have the Duffy null phenotype, and had more dose reductions and treatment delays, they did not have more neutropenic fever or treatment discontinuation due to their neutropenia. And like I said, a manuscript is in preparation right now, and we hope to present this data. But it's very important because it's addressing a specific issue to our African American patients. Another study we're participating on is a study looking at the risk of chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathy in African American women. And we know that our patients who are African American that take taxanes are more likely to develop significant neuropathy, and they are more likely to have a reduction in the dose of chemo as a result, and the concerns are how does this affect outcome. There has been some work that's been published by the study PI, Dr. Schneider and colleagues, that there might be a germline variant that predicts the risk of developing the neurotoxicity. So this study is capturing patients who undergo treatment for early-stage breast cancer with a taxane-based regimen and either get weekly Taxol or docetaxel as part of this regimen. And blood samples are collected, and we're looking, in the study, Dr. Schneider and colleagues are looking to see how the patients fare and their outcome, and whether those that have the germline predictor of peripheral neuropathy or taxane-induced peripheral neuropathy are going to do just as well or worse than those that don't. Other efforts that we have to promote clinical trial participation is really technology-driven. So we have via pathways connected to our chemotherapy entering a process, and so when you're entering an order, it tells you whether a clinical trial is available to your patients so that you know that the study is there. We also have the Jefferson Clinical Trial app, where not just us, but colleagues within the Jefferson system and outside can go on the app and try to see if there's a clinical trial that would be good for their patients. And these are just links for clinicaltrials.gov and cancer.gov, where patients and providers can look up various clinical trials that may be appropriate for them. And with that, I end my discussion, and I'm happy to take any questions by chat or later on by email. Thank you very much.